welcome to episode 7 of This Month in Security for January of 2023. I'm your host, Aubrey King, and this month I'll be joined by Aaron Brailsford.
I did ask it to write me an episode of This Week in Security, though, and it did a pretty passable job at that. So,
David Warburton.
What we considered secure, what we considered good practice 10 years ago, or even a year or two ago, probably isn't true anymore.
And we've got a special guest, Brian McHenry.
There's no firewall I can put in place between an attacker who's going to social engineer a customer service rep or an IT operations person. There's no firewall for that.
We'll be talking to Brian about his involvement with Security B-Sides NYC and a little bit more about the technologies that he's been interested in over time. And we'll talk about all the latest news in the security community for this month. So strap on those earbuds and get ready for This Month in Security. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Hey, Aubrey. Always good to see you. One of my oldest and dearest friends here at F5, and if any way I can do something to support you and help you out and support our community, I'm always there for it.
Awesome. Well, we love community first. That's really the way we go. So there were a couple of things that I wanted to talk to you about a little bit with respect to not just kind of what you do for your day-to-day job, but kind of a little bit in terms of your past experience. I mean, you've been in the field now, technology for how long would you say?
A little over 25 years now, getting up there.
You've got a lot of good experience there. If you want to kind of give the community an overview for the listeners out there that might not know you, F5ers might.
Yeah. So I'm into a couple of years into what I call the third act of my career. Currently leading product management for our web app and API security solutions, and that's across portfolio, distributed cloud, NGINX, Big IP. So when it comes to WAF, DDoS, API security, that's my thing. And how do I come to lead all this part of our portfolio is I spent the first act of my career in IT operations. Got my start like a lot of people in desktop support, doing a little bit of software validation actually as well, and moved on up to NOC and SOC type roles. That's when I first got exposed to Big IP and F5, and that presented the opportunity to become a sales engineer and join our technical sales team, where I spent the bulk of my 15 years at F5 either functioning as an SE, supporting our customers and our accounts, and then as a solution architect, touring most of the Western Hemisphere, talking about web app firewall, talking about SSL and the importance of encrypt, decrypt, as well as DDoS. And from there, I moved into roles more into security strategy for our sales team, as well as participating in our acquisitions of Shape and Volterra and ThreatStack. And that's where I sort of got the product strategy itch. And now, here I am in that third act I was talking about. And it's a real honor and a privilege to be able to lead the product teams and the engineering teams on this strategy to advance technology that I've come to depend on, not as a customer, but also as an engineer in the field for F5. And so this is just a huge privilege to be in this position, to take everything I've learned to date and apply it to our strategy, which always with me is customer first.
That's neat. I've loved watching kind of your rise and kind of watching your path as you sort of navigated through our organizations here. Now, with your current role, you are focused on WAP primarily. Is that that is correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So with that in mind, I guess one of the things that has kind of fascinated me over the past 6 months working on this podcast is the talk about guidance and things like that. I don't, I think some people might find that to be a little bit boring, but for me, it's one of those things that over time, you and I have talked about kind of how the sausage is made in a product organization and what that looks like from different perspectives. Now, this is one perspective that I've never even contemplated. How does a product organization kind of consume that sort of guidance like you would find from CISA And is it really kind of different, I guess, manufacturer to manufacturer, or even department to department?
So product management is a very interesting discipline, and the closer I got to work with it in my prior role in technical sales, the more I became to appreciate it, and it's obviously a part of why I chose to go into this field directly. It's part sales engineer. Our product manager is customer facing person who's able to communicate effectively to customers, as well as to our field sales team. Help to convey the message in a compelling way. They also spend a lot of time talking to analysts. I really encourage my team to engage with the analyst community to understand, to get an aggregate view of what they're hearing from customers, and also an outside view, not an F5 centric view. Often when you talk to an F5 customer about F5 solutions and technology, you get a bit of a colored view of how well we're doing. So we engage with analysts quite a lot to get that viewpoint. But also, monitoring those standards, monitoring whether it's recommendations from CISA, executive orders, NIST frameworks and updates, compliance like PCI DSS, SOX, SOC 2, all those things. Like, they all factor into how our product managers develop a strategy that's going to help really meet our customers where they're going, not where they are now, but really where they're going. And that's the trick, is trying to predict where our customers are headed, because you don't always know that, right? Not even if you ask a customer directly, they don't always know where they're going to be, or they think they know, and things change around us constantly. So it is a bit of a fortune teller's job in a way. If you're a Marvel fan, it's a Tony Stark futurist kind of thing. So you're wearing a lot of different skill sets as a product manager, and you're also handling escalations around the products that you own. So you're right there in the front lines, knowing what makes our customers unhappy as well as what makes them happy. So it's a really challenging discipline, but I think the people that do it really well are folks that really end up driving innovation into the products, and creating what I like to call customer delight. When you hear a customer say, "Hey, I couldn't have solved this problem without F5. I think your technology is making my life easier." That's a win. Whether you're an SE, whether you're in support, or in fact a product manager, you hear that kind of thing. That's why we do the job. That's why we go out there and try to build things that help you address whatever your compliance needs are, whatever your risk mitigation strategy is, and really try to help you anticipate emerging standards, and whether that's around compliance or just changes in the technology or threat landscape.
So it sounds to me like it's really just, I guess, almost ingrained in the conversation already. Like, it doesn't even need to be, have a point person or anything like that. It's already talked about.
Yeah,
because that's what the customer is driving as well. So
exactly, it comes from all those inputs come from all the different engagements that product managers go on. It's from SEs, it's from participating in standard bodies, it's from analyst engagements, but first and foremost, always from customer engagements. But all those things fuse together into what ends up becoming most important in our product strategy.
Cool. Okay, now switching gears like completely. One of these other things that I have seen you do through time is you were the first guy that I ever heard say B-sides. And I remember when you said that, I went, what is that? I'm not sure what that is. Yeah. And now, B-sides is B-sides. And we even have one up here in the frozen tundra of Rochester, New York. Yeah. So I was wondering kind of how, I guess, what drew you to B-sides in the first place? Because you sort of knew it before it came up, was my perception. Mm-hmm. And then, how has that journey gone through the years? You've been involved for a long time.
Yeah. I got involved back in 2014 or so. Hard to pin down exactly. I was on Twitter. I was doing a lot of talks at different conferences in my role at the time. and at times lamenting my inability to get my talks accepted at things like RSA and Black Hat, and stumbled across the B-Sides community, actually crossing paths with Jack Daniel on Twitter. So if you don't follow Jack on Twitter, recommend it. He's an interesting follow, and a guy that's been in the industry for quite a long time. He's one of the founders of Security B-Sides, and it was founded, and I'm not sure when they started off the top of my head, but it was founded around that notion of, hey, I had this really great idea, great talk, but it didn't get accepted by RSA, it didn't get accepted by Black Hat. And the first B-Sides, I forget if it was, I think it was Las Vegas first. There was a B-Sides Las Vegas, which was, hey, all the talks that you didn't get accepted into Black Hat or DEF CON, we'll take those talks. And sometimes there are things that are a little bit off the beaten path and don't really fit into, what those big conferences are looking for. And the same thing with B-Sides San Francisco as sort of the B-side to the A-side, which is, the RSA conference.
RSA, yeah.
And so that's, really the initial ethos is creating a hyper local conference, most often offered for free. So no registrations, fully sponsor funded. So I thought, wow, this is such a great thing, and we don't have that in the New York metro area where I live in New Jersey. And so I reached out to Jack Daniel, and so 90% of doing anything in this life is don't be afraid to reach out to that person that you think might be too busy or too important. Jack is like this InfoSec luminary, and he was very quick to respond and say, hey, this is how you get started. Gave me the quick getting started. It took several years for me to get Security B-Sides New York City, NYC off the ground. It was working with a couple of guys, Brad Antanovich, who works, I believe, at Cisco these days, and another guy by the name of Glenn Edwards. So the three of us all came to the B-Sides organization independently, and they connected us together. And so we kind of tirelessly, pushed the effort forward as the sort of three co-founders. And eventually in 2016, John Jay College, who's a big criminal justice college, we got a contact there, Dr. Lovely, who's was one of the professors back there in 2015, 2016. And he said, yeah, we'll donate the space. So we were able to offer a free conference in Manhattan, in a large space, for everybody. And that was such a win. And then 2017, we had to kind of take the year off. Everybody got a little busy. I think one of the guys had his first kid, and I think I got promoted, and another guy moved jobs, but then we brought it back in 2018. Then we lost our contact at John Jay College in 2019, and then 2020 came. We all know what happened then. And now we're coming out of it again, and I'm not as involved as I once was. There's a whole new crew, new school, next gen, taking the torch from me and the original founders. But we're going to have another event in April. John Jay is back on board to host us. They have such a great space there, and they have as a criminal justice, criminology type of school focus, have a good cyber program. So really, great synergy there of who our sponsor is, and really excited to see, with another generation of folks carrying it forward. Really, the other impetus behind getting involved when I did was information security as a profession has given so much to me. It's created a career and a prosperous lifestyle, and also a way to create technology that makes the internet a safer place, which is really what I'm lucky enough to be a part of. And I think about how hard it is to get into this industry, and I didn't really have anything other than sort of stumbling my way forward in various IT jobs, and to really kind of embrace information security as my focus. And I think, what can we do to give back to the community to create that opportunity for others? And so that's really, one of the ethos of Security B-Sides is to be more accessible. I talked about getting your talks accepted, but also make it free, so I don't need to pay for $1,000 conference ticket. So making this industry more accessible and giving people the opportunity to network and learn. So humbled to be a part of a team that's got this going in New York City, where it's hard to do things for free and accessibly. And so this, I'll certainly leave a legacy at F5 behind, but I've been here for 15 years, but I think the legacy that in the industry I'm most proud of is hopefully Security B-Sides New York chapter goes on to continue to be successful in years to come, and that's something that now happens and creates opportunity for others. Because this is such a great field. There's so much good you can do in the world by being involved. No matter how, whether you're a programmer, a coder, you're an attacker, you're a defender, you're a sales engineer, you're in product development, whatever you want to do. There's lots of ways to help make the internet a safer place. It's just about getting in the door and seeing that cybersecurity is a field for all of us.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just coming out of the pandemic, right? We're starting to do more events and things like that. And one of these things that I noticed, the reason why I ended up bringing up B-Sides, really, B-Sides Rock showed up from out of nowhere. I mean, I haven't seen anything out of them in a long time on socials, but I, like so many other people, have been exploring Mastodon. And on InfoSec Exchange, they were showing B-Sides Rock. It came up in my area, so. It just so happens that one of the influencers that I follow is going to be at the next meeting. They're flying in, and so I'm going to go and check that. I'm very excited to really take part in it. So,
yeah, our first B-Sides, one of our keynotes was a guy by the name of Chris Wesopel, who was at Veracode for some time, is one of the original guys in the old school hacking crews from Loft and those folks. And so, got to meet him, and he gave a talk that year that 2016, that really changed my view of the world. He talked about shifting from the military paradigm of attack and defense and, building higher walls, and really talking about it from safety. So you heard me say, make the internet a safer place a bunch of times. That's like my motto, if you will, what drives me as a professional. And that's really comes from Chris, at Weld Pond on Twitter. So Chris Wesopel's talk there, he talked about move to a notion of safety, right? He talked about the analogy of a toaster, right? A toaster, is inherently an unsafe thing, right? You take a flammable thing, a piece of bread, you stick it in, you turn it on some heating elements, and then you hope it doesn't catch fire and toast it just right. And we take it for granted that that's a safe thing to do. We don't yet have that luxury on the internet. Sharing our information, whether it's for personal or business reasons, is a inherently unsafe act on the internet. And it's our job as practitioners, whatever role we play, to try to make it a more safe by default, and the threat and the risk is the exception. And so he really changed my mind about how to think about this attack, and go away from this military attack and defense paradigm and get into this internet safe use paradigm, and making it safe and easy for everyone to be on the internet and not have to be a tech savvy person hovering over links and being concerned about phishing and malware and gosh, whatever else.
There's something to be said for usability too. That's got to say that.
Yeah. Security is only as good as it is usable.
That's right. What is that? The first tenet of good security is availability, I think, is what I used to say. All right. So the last thing that I had kind of as an in-depth question here for you is that you've been involved in application security for as long as I've known you, and you've been building solutions for application security for as long as I've known you. You helped me figure out how to do it. That was you I think taught me some of my first stuff on ASM way back. So with that in mind, looking at the architectures from back when I started 12 years ago, that we used to look at these, giant pairs of WAFs, sometimes wedged inside firewalls and whatnot. The architectures are very different today. So I kind of wanted to get an idea from you, how you saw, that change in architecture, what may have driven that, and where might we go in the future with WAP architectures? I mean, you've got to be thinking forward with your role, I'd imagine. So I figured I'd ask and see if you could reveal.
Yeah, absolutely. So our tagline for our security vision is securing apps and APIs everywhere. And let me pick that apart a little bit. Securing part is obvious, apps and APIs. And so why would we say both? Well, there's a notion of a web application, but there's also a notion of an API. And increasingly, we're moving to more API-centric models of delivering applications, and less, a traditional web app that's, server resident. So really drawing that, that clear line that we were very inclusive of every type of application architecture. And then, really the most key word in that tagline is everywhere. Applications, to your point, Aubrey, completely distributed, completely variable in terms of how they're architected. Things that were sitting behind, a pair of, F5 application delivery controllers back in the day probably are still sitting there. New apps may not be getting spun up behind that environment, and you need fit for purpose technologies. And my mantra is to meet the customer where they are. That's how we achieve that's availability of security everywhere. And so that's why we make things available on NGINX in as uniform a fashion as we do on Big IP, as we do on distributed cloud. And so some of this is the evolution of architectures, right? So what's driving that? Well, things like Kubernetes get popular because it enables me to move faster and do complex things in a high velocity fashion, high continuous delivery models and so forth. So we adopt these architectures because there's an underlying business benefit. And in most cases, this is because I can move fast as a developer and deliver this stuff. So our goal has got to be to be part of that architecture earlier on in the development lifecycle so that we don't slow down the business and in fact become an enabler. So that's things like our NGINX App Protect plugins for that architecture. But then you mentioned usability, right? So there's the usability of security from a consumer or from a end user point of view, right? Like how good is my password manager in terms of, does it lock down all my passwords? Yeah, it does a good job, but it's a pain in the ass to use on multiple different platforms, mobile, desktop, et cetera. Then I'm never going to use it. And so similarly, that usability notion exists on the operator administrator side. And that's, what's really driving a lot of our focus on distributed cloud, delivering as a service. A lot of our customers would love to deliver advanced WAF policies for every single app in their environment that it naturally sits behind a big IP, but they don't have enough people to operate a complex appliance-based web app firewall. So by offering it as a service, we're trying to take a lot of the complexity out, make it something that's widely available, regardless of your architecture. If you front end it with a SaaS, the architecture becomes less important if you're comfortable with using SaaS-based services and proxying your traffic through our platform. So that's a way that we're affecting usability and trying to keep up with the speed of business as well, and make sure that we're not slowing anybody down in their goal to publish better application and API experiences for their customers, but with security built in to the design from the earliest phase possible. So, speed and usability are really driving the way we do things and how we bring our portfolio of application security solutions together.
Thanks so much for coming on the show to talk to us, Brian. It's always great to share your perspective with the community. Moving on, we're going to dive right into the news from January. Talking about the breach updates, there were a significant number of breaches this month, Aaron, yeah?
Oh, yeah. Granted, one of the ones goes back to December, but considering the news just keeps coming out, I'm going to put it in January along with all of the others. So LastPass, obviously we can't really talk about breaches without talking about LastPass. But Circle CI, which is CI/CD management system, were breached, and that included people's secrets that were stored in Circle CI. Royal Mail, the UK Postal Service, has had a cybersecurity incident, which almost certainly started with some kind of a breach into the organization. It's probably ransomware that is stopping them from sending mail outside of the UK right now. In fact, we've all in the UK been asked not to post anything overseas because it won't go there. We also saw the TSA's no-fly list breached and leaked out of a feeder airline in the US. And that was another breach of cloud-stored data that Kyle talked about in This Week in Security a week or so ago. And I think, the news doesn't stop, right, of these breaches. After the This Week in Securities that we're kind of talking about in this month in security, in the last day or so, GitHub have reported that they've had a breach, and that's resulted in the code signing certificates for 2 of GitHub's apps being stolen. They have no evidence that those code signing certificates have been used, but that they were stolen. So GitHub Desktop for Mac and Atom applications are essentially being new versions rolled out with new signing certificates. It's, the news of breaches just doesn't stop.
Yeah, it would appear that way. And it's funny you mentioned the Circle CI one. That's something I've been doing a little bit of research into one of the new OWASP projects, which is the top 10 for CI/CD pipelines. They actually have a project for that. I don't think it's an official project, but it's at least in focus at the moment. And that's one of those things that they really talked about was, hey, you can really breach software I shouldn't say pretty easily, but it's a good time, I guess, if that's your aim, to really try and get in on the pipeline level so that you can continuously reinfect and spread out as you go. I think pretty soon we're going to be having a little bit of a snippet on the OWASP CI/CD top 10. I'm not sure when we're going to be doing that, but we should probably take a moment to mention it on the show too at some point.
Yeah, I think LastPass and Circle CI and I suppose the GitHub breach, they're all about sensitive, secret information being stolen, right? Passwords, API access keys or AWS keys, tokens, sorry. And that's come into focus, at least in the last month. I think CISA released an article on knowing where your secrets are. And that's a big challenge, right? We store secrets all over the place because we have distributed systems that are living in the cloud and on-prem, hybrid systems. Everything needs to talk to other systems, and you secure that access using secrets. But they've got to be stored somewhere because the human isn't pumping them in. And that's it is relatively easy to breach an organization because usually soft, fleshy things, humans, right, are the way into most orgs. And once you're in, stealing the secrets just lets you pivot across all of the infrastructure, exfiltrate whatever you want.
I think to your point, Aaron, it's what really fascinates me from a security point of view. Now, I like to kind of get geeky and nerd out about crypto stuff and all the latest technologies, but actually so much of security, like probably the most pivotal part of security is trust. Really, everything that we do from certificates to password managers ultimately always requires some element of trust between various parties. That's what underpins it. If it literally was just person A and B, Alice and Bob talking to each other and there were no other third parties, you wouldn't necessarily need as much trust. You wouldn't need the same kind of infrastructure and reliance. But as soon as you involve a single third party, and then we're on the internet, we're involving millions of third parties, we rely on all these kind of protocols and solutions and vendors to provide that element of trust. The one thing I'm being asked a lot about at the moment is password managers following the LastPass breach. And there have been plenty of news articles recently looking at how Bitwarden has, the way they kind of have the number of hashes for storing users' master passwords. There've been Safari and other kind of password managers. They've all had an increasing element of time by researchers spent on them. And we put as users, whether we're using this for enterprise use, whether it's for personal use, a huge amount of trust into these organizations to hold our really probably the most important secrets, not just our passwords. For many of us, we're storing credit card details in our password vaults. We're storing social security numbers and other really private information in these kind of secure notes that you can put along with your passwords. So there's a huge amount of trust that goes into it. And ultimately, what do we decide to do as users, right? Do we kind of figure out that actually the risk isn't worth it? It's not, we can't trust these third parties, or do we find some way to kind of mitigate that risk and ultimately decide that we have no choice but to trust these third parties and to do what we can to, as I said, mitigate that risk?
I find it interesting that we've got also shared cloud storage as kind of a theme in some of these attacks. And the funny thing that it makes me think about is, especially as we watch LastPass just snowball and become just a huge mess, it's not the same kind of security threats that we had when I started working for F5. I mean, you think back to 10 years ago, and the kind of the biggest stuff that we really had was, brute force, 3DOS. These are kind of, but now some of these techniques are really really very interesting. I'm curious to see what happens with LastPass and if we're going to see an end to this story at any point soon.
Breaches are inevitable, right? And I don't really cast aspersion on LastPass. I'm sure they were doing everything they could to prevent what happening. What I think is commendable in reading the disclosure, right? They said, hey, we got owned, they owned it, but hey, we did everything right. Not just about setting up a good, strong perimeter, right? Like which ultimately got breached. They did that, but they didn't say that, and what we see in a lot of these breaches is that the perimeter gets breached and then the vendor, whoever it is that got owned, acts surprised when sensitive data then is compromised. It's, well, you got to plan for an already breached state. And a lot of people don't necessarily always understand the context of that. What is meant when we say that? Well, what is meant when we say that is like, assume you're already breached, assume you're going to get breached. What happens then? How do you reduce the risk of the impact that happens then? And so all of the default configurations that LastPass has been providing since I think 2018 make it so that it's going to take literal millions of years for someone to brute force hack any of these vaults that got compromised. And so that's really just a great example of what a defense in depth architecture looks like, what a assumed breach management and response plan looks like. So really, hey, it sucks that it happened, but don't let this stop you using password managers. And in fact, don't let it stop you using LastPass if that's the one that you got used to and you like, and you've integrated it into the ways that you work. If it works for you and you like it, keep using it, because you've got a security vendor in LastPass that honestly, hats off to you guys. You got the worst possible thing happened, but you did all the right things to make sure that the impact to your users and to the data that you were safeguarding was minimal. So really, you can take a negative slant and slam them for it, but I can only say that, they did the right things in from what I know.
I think what will be interesting for me is seeing, and I really I've been a staunch LastPass user for, I want to say, decades. I wasn't certainly customer number one, but I was on pretty early on, and have stuck with them with kind of various kind of either breaches or security vulnerabilities that were discovered in, say, the browser extensions for years. Because ultimately, I kind of believe in that zero trust, that zero knowledge kind of architecture, whereby as long as I'm the only one that has my master password, in theory, people can steal my encrypted blob of passwords. They're not going to do anything with it because it's encrypted. And as long as the crypto is good, we're fine. Of course, the problem is once you realize that actually there are other aspects to it. It's not the pure crypto necessarily that's a problem. And there are unfortunately questions as to the crypto use in LastPass as well. Things like the metadata, the number of hashes that are used to secure your master password, your email address, the sites you go to, all these kind of things, unfortunately, give attackers really good clues and really narrow or shorten the kind of time needed to kind of crack any one individual vault. So it will be interesting to see how many people stick around. I know just anecdotally, so many people, unfortunately, move into other password managers. That said, I don't think password managers are going to go away anytime soon. We're still reliant on them. We've been kind of calling or foreshadowing the death of passwords for, again, what feels like decades. We're never quite there. It's been like IPv6, it feels like. But, with FIDO's passkeys coming out and being kind of rolled out slowly, who knows? Maybe we'll get to a point where we don't need to give away so many of our secrets, but I certainly don't see it happening anytime soon.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about getting away from passwords. We've been talking about using passphrases, for example, for years at this point, and how it's easier to remember passphrases than it is passwords that have upper, lower numbers, exclamation marks, whatever. But the number of times that I'll sign up for a website, probably an e-commerce site, and it's going to enforce, it's got to be, more than 8 characters. It's got to have an uppercase character, a punctuation mark, and a number in it. That message of make things easy to remember never got through.
No, exactly. And this is so frustrating. I completely agree with you. I would much prefer that people use 4 to 5 word passphrases than a mediocre kind of short password that has punctuation and numbers in. because there are very few sites that will prevent you from putting a punctuation mark or a number at the end. And yet, if you ask people to add punctuation marks and numbers, they'll probably stick them at the end. And so that's a huge clue and advantage for attackers, because they'll go through dictionary words and then just iterate with numbers at the end. But you've kind of hit on one of my little pet peeves. In fact, I wrote an article on Labs a few months ago now about the relative strength or perceived strength of passphrases, because clearly one of the perceived strengths is the length. And absolutely, if you have a passphrase that's 30, 40 characters because of the words, in theory, from a length point of view, that's far more secure than a 12 or 16 or 18 character password. And yet there's now evidence that there are tools out there to do effectively dictionary-based attacks on passphrases. And I won't bore you with the maths. You can go and look at Lab's article if you're into that kind of thing. But when you look at the actual kind of key space, if you like, the number of possible passwords based on the number of words that we use in the English language, on average, passphrases can be significantly weaker, So it's a really interesting kind of point. I think, yes, passphrases can be more secure as long as they're truly random and long enough, but they're not always quite giving us quite the security that we think. But again, to your point, Aaron, so many sites you go to won't let you use, passwords are sometimes too long, ironically, or they won't let you use passphrases because they have these arbitrary requirements in them.
Yeah, and it's 2023, and sometimes you'll click on the "I forgot my password" link, and it will still email you your password in the clear, which terrifies me.
I heard of a fascinating attack recently where the attacker was. This actually comes from a story from Darknet Diaries for anyone that kind of listens. So I can't claim to be the originator of this story. But the attacker actually, in this case, it was a pen tester, it wasn't a real attack, figured out that they could hit password reset links for an email address. Now, that in itself, you think, maybe isn't an avenue of attack. If I, Aaron, try and attack your account and I put your email address in, I don't receive that email address. I don't receive that email, so I can't, what do I get it? What do I get from it? But what the pen tester realized was the website was generating a very short, I think 5 or 8 character password. Now, he didn't know it. Again, he didn't have access to the email, but he knew that for a period of time, the password was only 5 characters. And to brute force any 5 characters is significantly easier than what the user's password may have been, which may have been 30 odd characters. So, there are still many, many sites that haven't unfortunately thought through all the possible different attack vectors for password resets.
Yeah, I've had sites do exactly that, right? Click reset my password, and your password is 1234 or whatever. It's very short. And I've had thoroughly frustrating conversations with the owners of websites whose website either is going to email you the password in the clear, that one happened not that long ago, a couple of years maybe, or email you a short password. And the response you'll get, these are usually relatively small companies, is, we've spoken to the guys that make our website and they say there's nothing wrong with this. And that's fundamental security messages aren't getting through.
Absolutely, but that's honestly half the problem. Is I think is just keeping up with different attack vectors. I honestly don't envy website developers, application owners, application defenders, because what we considered secure, what we considered good practice 10 years ago, or even a year or two ago, probably isn't true anymore. This kind of attack vector of sending out, a short-lived and short character of 5 passwords, who'd have thought necessarily that the attacker wouldn't have known the password, but they could have brute forced it in that small time window. And the fact that the attacker would have done it in the middle of the night when the real user was asleep to not see his email come through. So I don't envy people on the other side of the fence that actually have to protect their apps and data, because there are just so many different vectors, and keeping up to date with it is a really hard job.
Yeah, trust me, being on the defending side is like a never-ending losing battle. One last thing I wanted to say about that, the LastPass, and you mentioned people leaving LastPass and going to Bitwarden, amongst other solutions, but Bitwarden is the one that comes to mind, because this is, I guess, somewhat predictable. A couple of weeks after the LastPass news, when it really started gathering steam and people started talking about moving to Bitwarden, what did you see but phishing ads in Google? So, sponsored ads. When people search for Bitwarden, what you were actually getting in the ads was links to fake Bitwarden, right? Malicious code that is not Bitwarden, but that people would presumably go and download and think that they were placing their trust in Bitwarden, but we're getting something very different indeed.
Boy, and maybe someone signing up for Bitwarden at that phishing site uses their 1Pass or LastPass username and password.
Yeah.
Yikes. One other thing that we've seen in the news a lot recently is ChatGPT. And I've done a bit of poking around with that, mostly with Boo on DevCentral. He's been very, very much into it. And for me, I look at it really more as kind of like, a way to very easily get my configurations created, figure out how to have something to make my Terraforms, my Ansibles, and write scripts for me, things of that nature. But I think there are some other security implications for ChatGPT as well. I'm just curious how ChatGPT impacts the security landscape from your perspective.
From my point of view, I'm kind of looking a little bit forward, further forward. We've seen evidence. SharePoint researchers, I think only a few weeks ago, found evidence on forums of attackers using ChatGPT to write malicious code, which I think was, I would say, one of the first real eye openers. But we keep having eye opening events to do with ChatGPT. We have the news that ChatGPT effectively passed an MBA and effectively passed an astrophysics exam, albeit not with an amazing score. But these kind of capabilities are insane, and the fact that it can write code is incredible in and of itself, really. But again, the Checkpoint researchers found that researchers were using them to write malicious code. Now, the code itself wasn't particularly unique. It was info stealers, searching your machine for documents and send them off to a drop zone or a hacker-hosted site, effectively kind of encryptors or ransomware type tools. So these tools, this code isn't unique. What is impressive and what is really worrying, and a general trend we've seen for years actually, is that the person actually writing this had zero coding skills, very, very low coding skills, and they didn't need any to write this kind of code. So what we're seeing is a continual lowering of that barrier to entry for anyone that wants to, partake, down the kind of malicious threat actor route, basically, just completely eroding that barrier. Anyone with zero skills can go and ask ChatGPT to give it a basic function and it will write the code. Now, there are warnings in ChatGPT that if it suspects you're writing malicious code or doing something against its terms of service, aren't allowed, it will warn you, but very rarely is it actually stopped, and attackers have already found ways around that.
Boy, it seems to empower your physical or social hackers, give them a brand new bag of tricks almost. How about you, Aaron?
Yeah, absolutely. Even
go ahead, David. Sorry.
I was just going to say, even those, the kind of career hackers, those that have connections in the world, on the forums, whether it's dark or surface web, probably have access to this code and skills already. But as you said, Aubrey, this completely empowers like a brand new generation, if you like, of hackers and hacktivists possibly that don't have the skills or connections to go and lean on to borrow or even purchase code. They can just go and create their own.
Yeah, we used to talk about, script kiddies who would just be reusing someone else's tools. Well, what you're saying is now they don't need to reuse someone else's tools. They can just have ChatGPT write them something that probably does what they were looking for broadly and probably does it okay. I think for me, ChatGPT is like the problem with it, aside from the fact that it lowers the bar so much, is that there's no oversight. So if you're using it to write code and you don't have the coding knowledge to understand what's coming out, and let's face it, if you write a lot of code with it, reviewing all of that code, even for like relatively small amounts, gets time consuming. Reviewing that code for security problems, for vulnerabilities in the code, and you can bet that code will start ending up in commercial products or open source projects. Mm-hmm. And nobody will be keeping an eye on what's coming out and understanding what's coming out. Not to mention the maintainability nightmare, right, of poorly documented code that nobody understands how it works in the first place. And someone's going to have to fix bugs in that.
No, absolutely. And Philip was chatting with the rest of the lab team yesterday, and Malcolm on the team had a really good point, which is, we talk about vulnerabilities in software libraries. Not good. Vulnerability in OpenSSL or any of the other really, really common libraries could affect dozens, hundreds, thousands of different products and software versions. In theory, though, if we patch that one library, all the other projects that depend on it should benefit from that fix if they update the libraries. That's not necessarily true of the likes of ChatGPT. If ChatGPT is, and I don't know that it is, but if it were to create vulnerable code and create that multiple times for different people, there's no central library that gets used, right? That same vulnerable code has potentially been created dozens, hundreds, thousands of times. Fixing that then becomes much more difficult for anyone that is relying on that code.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things that you start to think about. I think about making it easier for attackers to automate social engineering, right? Think about that for a second. Social engineering right now is probably still one of the most high risk, high impact vectors of attack, right? Because it's one person talking to another person. There's no technical controls for that. There's nothing. There's no firewall I can put in place between an attacker who's going to social engineer a customer service rep or an IT operations person. There's no firewall for that. There's no endpoint security detection. It's hoping that the person that's targeted has the savvy. And true story, just a couple of weeks ago, I got texted something that said, "Oh, Chase fraud alert," and it came from the number that the Chase fraud alert usually comes from, formatted, looked like the Chase fraud alert, and it said, respond back yes or no if you've gotten if you recognize this charge, and I respond back no. Then I immediately get a phone call, which comes from the phone number that's on the back of my Chase card. Okay. And I start talking to this person, and they're like, and eventually they say, well, I need you to text me your username and password. And then I'm like, whoa, wait a second, right? I was all the way down the road with this, and then they asked me to do something I was on the phone with this person. And then I said, hey, I can't send you that. And they said, well, this is the standard practice. And I said, no, I'm a cybersecurity professional. You should never need my password. And then all of a sudden I hear some stammering and then click. But all that is to say is that that was a very, sort of human intensive process there. And it almost got me as a professional, right? So it almost got me. So I can imagine someone who's less, savvy getting caught up in that and having a moment where they end up giving away sensitive information purely by accident. Now enter ChatGPT into the mix. One of the things that's made application security such a high target in recent years is going away from the network layer is it's possible to automate a lot of probing for vulnerabilities, right? We can probe and see if there's a SQL injection vulnerability or what have you. That's something that I should then go and focus on exploiting. Imagine automating social engineering at scale, right? Trying to find the vulnerable person that'll give you that information. There's a number of different ways you can kind of look at ChatGPT through that cybersecurity lens. But one that comes to me that makes me break out into a cold sweat a little bit is, hey, social engineering is this really vulnerable vector that we don't have good technical controls for, and now they've got a tool that can make them able to automate it at scale, trying to find that one person who will take the bait.
Yeah, and that's something I was thinking about earlier was, ChatGPT's been trained, right? It's been trained on an enormous data set. We don't know what problems were in the data set it was trained on. I mean, that extends beyond just coding, right? All of the other data it was trained on, like you say, it's passed exams, passed them with not a great score, but that could be because the training data was off. And, it's garbage in, garbage out. It's enormously problematic. I did ask it to write me an episode of This Week in Security, though, and it did a pretty passable job at that. So my job got a lot easier.
Yeah, no, I'm seriously considering employing it as a co-author for new articles on our site. The other aspect of ChatGPT, though, well, a couple actually that I find really a potential worry. We're not quite there yet, but clearly with what people are already doing with it, it's probably not that far away, is the ability to go and find vulnerable code. So ironically, it's not just the risk of creating vulnerable code, it's the ability to say, go and scan every single GitHub repo you can find and find me any vulnerability. And when it gets connected to the internet, which I believe is coming up quite soon, that could be a real problem. Hopefully there'll be oversight and controls in place. But again, ChatGPT isn't the only system like this that can do a similar job. So that threat is very, very real. Something that's been causing a lot of very kind of keen interests. I've been speaking a lot recently around automation and bots, the kind of reseller bots, systems that can buy your Taylor Swift tickets before you can, that kind of problem, and the kind of impacts it can have to business and retail and so on. Well, a lot of the problem we've got with those automation, those bots, is they are employing algorithms and tools to make their interactions appear more human, so that mouse movements look less linear and more random, like a human would do. And the typing is a bit more sporadic and not so automated. Well, if you kind of take the logic of ChatGPT and the AI that we're generating and apply that to real-time interactive attacks from AI-based tools, suddenly we've got a potential in, who knows, just a few months' time, maybe a year's time, where there are a huge number of automated attacks that look completely genuine. And that's the problem we've got at the moment. A lot of ways of kind of mitigating these automated attacks is to try and figure out through heuristics and interaction whether it's a human interacting with the site or some kind of bot or script. Well, when that interaction is automated but looks to be completely human, suddenly, your job defending against that kind of automated attack becomes an awful lot more difficult.
Well, may higher powers help the hacker that keeps me from my Taylor Swift tickets. I will have to break out a Loic and Hoic run on whoever that is. Moving on, though, one of the other interesting pieces of news that we saw, really hot off the press, right? FBI's takedown of the Hive. Just to put it out there, I didn't know what this was when I first saw it. It was amazing. I mean, just going to these sites and seeing, hey, this site was taken down by the FBI in relation to, the Hive group. It was really kind of a dramatic and very, very drastic visual, I guess, for me to see, the hackers taken down. I'm used to seeing it the other way. I'm used to seeing a corporate website being taken down and I have to install a web app firewall or help a customer deploy a web app firewall to mitigate that sort of thing. But to actually see the hack sites get taken down, it is such a great thing. You guys care to elaborate on thoughts on this one? For me, it's very exciting. Anyone? Bueller?
So I think it's a really impressive achievement is the word I'm looking for, because takedowns can be very difficult. And legitimate takedowns, there are many hosts out there who will just ignore takedown notices. So those who aren't working for law enforcement agencies can have, a terribly frustrating time trying to get simple phishing sites removed that are impersonating their systems. So the fact that the FBI has, en masse, it seems, gone round and hacked back, it's a great effort and an impressive end.
From what I read on it, it sounded like they really penetrated really deep into that. The network sounds like they got involved in the social aspect of things a little bit and were able to gain a foothold like any other seasoned hacker would do. And I guess once you have penetrated down into the center, you should, in theory, be able to take everything out. Although that said, I'm not so sure we have seen the last Hive, right? I mean, there were no arrests made was another thing that I read, which is that's tough. They're still out there.
Yeah, if the people are still out there, it's, you just spring back up, right? It's just start up your infrastructure in a new place under a slightly new name, then off we go again.
Retool. Yeah.
That's ultimately what the FBI didn't just want to take down these services, right? That's obviously that's a goal, but that's an intermediary goal on the way to actually getting these people who are behind these services behind bars and unable to stand up yet another service and continue this game of whack-a-mole. So my suspicion, and this is Brian talking, not F5, not any direct knowledge of anything. I haven't talked to any FBI agents, but what I suspect is that for as long as they were inside the Hive systems and able to, they did a lot of work in terms of getting decryption keys and protecting people who had already been owned, making sure that they got, the decryption key without paying them ransom. So they were able to do a lot of sort of, good Robin Hood style work being inside their systems. I think they went and burned this asset because let's go take down all these servers because we've been detected, right? The folks in the Hive figured out that somebody was inside their systems, inside their network, and said we need to start fleeing like roaches in the daylight. And so that's, my suspicion is that, they got detected, which, happens. Unfortunate that, no arrests just yet. Maybe they still have a trail they can follow, but good on the FBI. This is the kind of work, we hear about, we're as a nation, as a corporations in our nation, we're always being attacked by other nation states. And I hear a lot of disparaging comments in the general population in the media, like, why aren't we doing more to counteract these cyber threats, whether they're nation state threats or large organized crime units. And make no mistake, Hive was a large organized crime unit. When you're talking about $100 million in ransoms that they collected over the period of time they were in operation, that's an organized crime corporation. And so, great work there by the FBI, showing that we do have good cyber capabilities here in the U.S. Whether it's cyber warfare, in our military branches or in our intelligence agencies like the FBI, we've got great cyber capability. And tie it back to the security B-sides message. There's lots of different ways you can get involved in this field. We've had former FBI speak at F5 events. We've had them at B-sides events. These are I've talked to a lot of active agents in the FBI who are in the cyber affairs division. Really interesting stories from the front lines of people trying to do the good work of rooting out cyber criminals and making sure that again, make the internet a little bit safer place.
Yeah, we see this time and time again, don't we? Predominantly with organised crime and especially ransomware groups that kind of go quiet for a bit. They come back. They might have renamed in the meantime. It might be a different group taking on the previous name. They very rarely, if ever, go away completely. I don't think they ever get to the point where they think, oh, do you know what? We've earned enough. We can retire and stop now. They're just going to keep going, and ultimately there'll be an influx of new, members that want to carry on and earn for themselves. Something I've kind of been saying recently, and it was in our last predictions piece we put out at the end of last year, was I think the kind of increasing need for geopolitical kind of pressure. Clearly the likes of the FBI and actual task forces that can go and do hands-on proactive hacking back. Fantastic, and I think that needs to increase. But I think ultimately the thing that's going to have the real difference is each country, each nation's kind of government putting pressure and actually, enforcing. Well, putting pressure on these groups, closing them down, and enforcing kind of local, like legal rulings and prison time, and so that pressure needs to kind of be mounted from different governments onto each other, because at the moment, we kind of talk about cyberspace being this big open world, and it's all this one big flat, and it isn't. It's still borders and countries with their own rules and laws, and so we need other countries and local laws to put the bad guys away for us, basically.
So, David, what now that we've covered the news a little bit, what kind of things can we expect to see coming out of F5 Labs over the next month to a couple months?
Sure. Yeah, it's been a very busy kind of time for us at Labs, end of last year, start of this year. So publications have been sort of fairly quiet. We've had updates to our bots series. So for those that are interested in kind of bots and automation and how they can affect all sorts of business, we've got more articles on that. One particularly interesting one is on the ecosystem, which really breaks down into a lot of detail all of the different players in the kind of automation space. It's not just one person with a laptop and a script. It's this whole, range of players, from reseller bot creators to shippers to all sorts. So that's a really fascinating read. Keep your eyes peeled for the new DDoS report. That will be coming out in a number of weeks. So that's going to take a look at the past 12 months worth of DDoS attacks. And we'll share insights in terms of the types of threat vector, the type of DDoS attack vectors that are used and the various sectors affected. But one of the big things we have coming up is a CVE-based report. We're going to be looking at the CV landscape and how that's changed over the years. There's a huge report done in partnership with our external researcher, Scientia. And I mention it because as we put out the Sense Intel series that we do every month, where we look at the most common CVEs that attackers are using against our sensor network, the last one was just posted, I think, a week or so ago. This report looks at the past 10 plus years of the CVEs, right from the very start, and how things like CVSS scores and so on have changed over the years, or maybe how they haven't. So that's going to be a huge piece of work for us that we're hoping to release in the next month or so. And hopefully we'll be back when it's released to talk about it. It's not just for the lab team, but also the report authors. So hopefully, you'll be able to grill us and the author and really kind of break that report down and show all the goodness from it.
Fantastic. I can't wait to see it. And, thank you guys for joining me this month. It's been a fun as usual. And a little bit of a different format for the show. Thanks for tuning in to episode 7 of This Month in Security, where our guests were Aaron Brailsford, David Warburton, and Brian McHenry. I'm Aubrey King with DevCentral. Watch for clips all month on the DevCentral YouTube. And as always, have a great F5 day.